Hello, my name is Jennifer Koshatka Seman, and I am the author of Borderlands Curanderos, the worlds of Santa Teresa Urrea and Don Pedrito Jaramillo. And I'm so honored to share my work with the Heritage Museum and City of Industry, California, about Santa Teresa Urrea, a curandera who spent some time in California cities. So my presentation today will focus on Santa Teresa Urrea, a Borderlands Curandera in turn of the century California. Okay. So my book, Borderlands Curanderos, examines the lives of these two faith healers or curanderos who left Mexico in the late 1800s, but continued to heal people on the US side of the border until their deaths in 1906 and 1907, respectively. Teresa Urrea healed people in Northwest Mexico, the sort of Sonora region, and also in cities throughout the US Southwest. Don Pedrito Jaramillo conducted his healing practice in the South Texas Rio Grande Valley. So the book takes you inside the intimate or small worlds of both of these curanderos, showing how they were a part of the larger turn of the century worlds that they lived in. Let me go to another slide here. One of the main arguments that I make is that they healed both the individual bodies, individual sick bodies, as well as the broader social body at a time when racial segregation, Jim Crow in the South, Juan Crow in the Southwest, this time period when non-white peoples and cultural practices were deemed inferior, sometimes even dangerous. And thus they became targets of powerful institutions such as professional medicine, public health officials, the church, and even more broadly, the state. So in the book, I tell the stories of their small worlds and how those small worlds intersected with the larger worlds that they navigated. In particular, I situate their stories in some of the major transformations taking place at the turn of the 20th century, including the rise of professional medicine. In the book, I trace the ways in which professionalizing medicine sought to gain authority over healing, partly by attempting to silence curanderos and others who practice different kinds of healing not considered scientific. The book also looks at the rise of state power in the border region, and even broadly across the nations of Mexico and the United States in this period. In this period, both Mexican and US governments sought to suppress any resistance to both Mexican and US capitalist projects on both sides of the border. And so this is something that Teresa Urrea's story shows, as she was an advocate for indigenous land rights in Mexico, and later in Los Angeles for a Mexican labor union. And so these actions often made her an enemy of the state, so to speak, both in Mexico and the United States. So finally, the book examines the ways in which spiritual movements and institutionalized religion intersected with healing practices. Because curanderismo, the name of their healing practice, was a mix of indigenous healing practices, in the case of Teresa Urrea, spiritism and spiritualism, as well as some Catholic rituals. So again, today I will talk about Teresa Urrea. First, I will share a bit about her life before she crosses the border, and then focus on her time in California, where she lived briefly in San Jose, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and even briefly in Ventura. So a little bit of background on Teresa Urrea, where she came from, again, how she became a curandera and even a santa, a saint, or a people's saint, and how she came to cross the border into the United States. So in 1889, Teresa Urrea almost died. In fact, some thought she did die at one point and then came back to life. She was 16 and living on her father's ranch in the Cabora Ranch in Sonora in northwestern Mexico. A little bit of where she's from in Mexico is on this map here. Witnesses described how for approximately 13 days, she alternated between short bursts of convulsions, so intense that 6 men could not hold her down, followed by several hours of unconsciousness. interspersed with moments of lucidity where she talked about seeing visions and expressed her desire to eat dirt. When she awoke from this strange sickness, she had received the dawn, the supernatural gift of healing, as it is known in the practice of curanderismo. For adherents of curanderismo, it is the belief in the dawn that gives the curandero the power to heal. So after Teresa Urrea received her dawn, she was able to see where people were sick by looking at them and heal them by laying on hands or using herbal remedies, or sometimes using earth and sometimes even her own saliva. So according to eyewitness accounts published in several different newspapers, the first person Teresa Urrea healed after receiving her dawn was a young indigenous girl. This girl was brought to Teresa for healing because one of her legs was shorter than the others and she couldn't fully plant her foot on the ground, making it difficult to walk. Teresa rubbed her knee, stretched her shrunken leg, and commanded her to throw away the stick that she had used to support herself and walk. According to witnesses, the young girl did as Urea commanded, and she was able to plant her foot firmly on the ground and walk well. So this healing story reveals Teresa Urrea's engagement with the indigenous people she lived among, healed, and advocated for. Teresa Urrea was herself part indigenous, as her mother, Cayetana Chavez, was Tohueco. So almost from the moment she received her dawn and began healing, Teresa Urrea became known throughout Sonora and then really all of Mexico, as well as parts of the US, for her miraculous cures, her divinely sanctioned healing powers, and the multitudes of sick that she healed freely at her father's Cabora Ranch in Sonora. Her adherents called her Santa Teresa, or La Santa de Cabora, and even La Niña de Cabora. Various accounts from newspaper reporters or health seekers or just the curious and the skeptical, as well as concerned Mexican government agents, described the scene at Cabora where anywhere from several hundred to, according to some accounts, over 1,000 people visited on a daily basis to receive healing from Santa Teresa. So to demonstrate the reach of Teresa's story, La Voz de Mexico, a major newspaper in Mexico City, reported on this remote rural area of Northwest Mexico, where they described how, quote, and the quote here is on the slide, much attention is being drawn to the town of Cabora near the Mayo River because of the miraculous healing of a young girl of 17 years called Santa Teresa Urrea. This article, and many like it in Mexico City newspapers, reveal both the interest in Teresa Urrea as well as the biased attitude of many in Mexico towards Urea and the people that she healed. They would describe her adherents as superstitious or of the clase indígena, the indigenous peoples, here mostly Mayo, Yaqui, and others, using language that suggested that indigenous people were less, quote unquote, civilized or evolved. And this was the reason they believed that she was a saint. In other words, it was their ignorance that made them believe in Santa Teresa Urrea. They simply did not know better, according to this ideology. This attitude also served to justify the Mexican government's dispossession of indigenous lands and resources. At this time, and this is the late 19th century, late 1800s to the turn of the century, at this time, the government of Porfirio Diaz, the president of Mexico, encouraged foreign investment and development, especially in this northwestern part of the country, and at the expense of the peoples whose home it was, including the Yaqui and Mayo that Teresa Urrea healed and lived among, and this region here shown on the map. La Voz de Mexico also described her healing in this article and focused on how Teresa Urrea healed with earth, con tierra. Indeed, Teresa Urrea's style of healing involved earth, as well as touch, herbs, her client's belief in her healing power, as well as the use of water and her own saliva in some cases. Another newspaper, La Ilustración Espírita, describes how one man was carried by his friends to Teresa Urrea because he could not walk. He had suffered a wound in a mining accident. The mines in this area were significant employers of all people, indigenous people and others. And he believed that his wound, his illness was incurable. So he came to Teresa as the last hope. Her cure: she drank water, spat it out on the dirt, mixed the water and dirt into a poultice, and applied it to the man's wound. Witnesses claimed he was, quote, instantly cured. Another story is described in this article. A woman was brought to Teresa who had a hemorrhage in one lung. Witnesses describe how Teresa said to this woman, quote, "I am going to cure you with the blood of my own heart." Then she took saliva, in which appeared a drop of blood, mixed it with earth, and applied it to the middle of this woman's back. And according to this source, the hemorrhage was at once controlled and the woman cured. There's many, many, many stories like these. So news of these cures spread by way of the press. Stories of Teresa's healing reached newspapers in Arizona, Texas, and California, even as far as New York City. And this inspired ever more visitors to come to Cabora to be cured or simply to witness the miraculous powers of Teresa Urrea. As news of her miraculous healing spread throughout this region of northwestern Mexico and beyond, so too did her identity and popularity as Santa Teresa, as a people's saint, unsanctioned by the Catholic Church, but beloved by her adherents. Teresa's adherents believed she was a santa, a saint, and a curandera because she had been granted the don, the gift of healing from God, and thus her power came through him or the Virgin and the saints. Her successful cures were evidence of this. However, as Teresa cured people, she also spoke out against the government of Porfirio Diaz, in particular, his policies of dispossessing indigenous peoples of their homelands. So Teresa Urrea was expelled from Mexico by the president, Porfirio Diaz, because she was healing people, including the indigenous people of her region, Yaqui and Mayo and others, and telling them that they need not obey the orders of the government to give up their land to corporate investment in the name of order and progress, which was sort of the mantra of this period in Mexico and of the Diaz government. She was disrupting the Mexican state's project of modernization and progress, which came at the expense all too often of poor and indigenous peoples. This is an important part of Teresa Urrea's story because it shows how her power as a healer was both in her healing of individual bodies as well as speaking out against social injustices experienced by groups of people, such as the Yaqui and Mayo that she lived among. In particular, it was her advocacy for the Mayo, who at the point in the 1890s were actively resisting government appropriation of their land. And it was this advocacy that got Teresa Urrea expelled from Mexico. So as I mentioned, right, in this period, the United States as well as Mexico governments were actively dispossessing indigenous peoples of their land within their nations in order to build railroads, to mine for minerals, and pursue other business and capitalistic state-supported ventures. I won't go into the details of that particular story here, so I can move forward into Teresa Urrea's time in California, but I talk about that in the first chapter of Borderlands Curanderos. But it's important to understand that this was the reason that Teresa Urrea was kicked out of Mexico, that she was advocating for indigenous rights and sovereignty. So Teresa Urrea writes here or conveys to an interviewer, on the telegraphed orders of President Diaz, the governor and general sent me and my father out of Mexico without a trial when I had done nothing against order. And you see here Teresa Urrea in this image of the time she spent in El Paso, Texas, probably blessing or healing babies in this picture. And in this quote from Teresa Urrea, you see that she's using the words of the government, this idea of order. And she's expressing the fact that she had done nothing against order. So from 1892 to 1900, Teresa Urrea, her father, and eventually the whole family lived in border towns and cities such as Nogales, Arizona, and El Paso, Texas, and others. However, she continued to heal and inspire resistance to the Mexican government, even from the US side of the border, causing the US government to make common cause with the Mexican government in suppressing these border revolts that were happening. During the time that she lived in El Paso, there were several rebellions against the Mexican government staged on the US side of the border, and they were connected to her. While Teresa would publicly deny any involvement in these, it seems clear that she was actively supporting resistance to the oppressive government of Diaz, similar to other pre-revolutionary Mexican exiles, such as the Flores Magón brothers, who also had been expelled from Mexico and exiled to the US. So in El Paso, Teresa Urrea was under intense government surveillance and scrutiny, and this even continued when she and her family, her father had come with her and his extended family had moved to Clifton, Arizona to get away from sort of the hot spot of the border. So in 1900 then, Teresa moves from Clifton. So the families moved from El Paso in 1896 to Clifton in 1900. She lives with the family for those years, but she leaves home in 1900 and moves to California. And this is the first time that Teresa Urrea is truly on her own in terms of being away from her family, away from her father. So she first stops in San Jose and heals a 3-year-old boy sick with cerebrospinal meningitis. He had been deemed uncurable by physicians. So Teresa Urrea is hired as sort of a private healer for this family, a white family. And she's interviewed by the San Francisco Examiner because of her successful healing of this boy. And she begins to be promoted in the San Francisco Examiner and other papers in this region as the Mexican girl healer. This is one example of an article and a picture of Teresa healing. She began to do much press in this period. Teresa comes in Cause of Mercy, Mexican girl, famed as the Joan of Arc of Yaqui Indians of Sonora, is in San Francisco. So you can see by this title that the California press was picking up on stories that were happening in Mexico. So she was a known figure, even in California when she came. I also want to note that Teresa Urrea in 1900 is 27 years old. So she is no longer a girl, yet that name sticks. That's how the press describes her. So she stays in California, she moves to San Francisco, and she continues to do press and even more press, doing interviews, stories are written about her in the Examiner and other papers. And she also begins to heal on stage, to perform her healing for audiences. In San Francisco, Teresa gets caught up with a manager who sees potential in her to make money, and he begins to promote live shows where she heals in front of audiences. Remember that this is the time of Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows. And so there's a kind of appetite for this sort of entertainment featuring exotics, indigenous peoples, and others. And Teresa's manager is hoping that the Mexican girl healer will inspire audiences to come and buy tickets to see her heal. However, the response to Teresa Urrea's first show is not enthusiastic. One reviewer describes how most of the audience left before Teresa's 90-minute healing demonstration was over, saying it was quiet and uneventful. There was not enough showbiz in her healings. In fact, on stage, Teresa simply healed people the way she did in private or in other informal spaces. And so here is a definition of her healing practice. These are Teresa Urrea's words quoted in a newspaper. So she describes her healing this way, quote, in treating a patient, I take his hands in mine, not grasping them tightly, but only clasping the fingers and pressing each of my thumbs against each of his thumbs. Then, after a while, I place one of my thumbs on his forehead just over the eyes. And she goes on, it is this way. You have headaches. Sometimes your head feels heavy. Your heart does not at all times beat regularly. Sometimes it palpitates too rapidly. Your stomach is not as good as it should be. Do you feel a little electric thrill entering your thumbs? No? Sometimes I cannot communicate the thrill to patients, and then I cannot cure them. So shortly after her public healing performance in San Francisco, 3 female friends of Teresa Urrea, including a prominent spiritualist medium named Madame Young, helped Urea file a complaint before a San Francisco judge against Teresa's manager. And his name, her manager and promoter, is J.H. Suits. So Teresa had complained to these women who had become her friends that she was, quote, virtually kept a prisoner by her manager, and she wanted her liberty. The judge ruled that Urea was free to break the contract she had with her manager, and a few days later, she took out an advertisement in the San Francisco Call classifieds, and this is how she described herself. Santa Teresa, the Mexican healer, removed to 2630 California Street. And I think it's interesting here to note that she's taken girl out of her name. She's been referred to over and over again in the press as the Mexican girl healer. And here she is simply Mexican healer. Now, that could just be that there was a word limit. And so that word was taken out for economic purposes, or it could have been intentional. But I think it's worth noting that this sort of moment of emancipation from this manager, with the help of women, positions her in a new place, sort of more in charge of her healing practice and her life, perhaps. So she was able to get out of this bad contract and open up her own healing practice. So Teresa Urrea leaves San Francisco in 1901, and she embarks on a healing tour across the United States without a manager or a promoter. On this tour, she's interviewed quite a lot, and there's like spreads of her, as you see here, and this is from the New York Journal. In these interviews, she discusses her healing. She also discusses her thoughts about things like theosophy, a spiritual tradition gaining in popularity at the turn of the century. And she talks about making plans to go to France, to India, to Egypt, to all these places to study magnetic and anatomical sciences. One quote from one of these articles says that she said, "Theosophists say that some astral body is making itself manifest through me. Whatever it is, it came to me while I was in a trance." So she's on this quest to find out more about these powers that she possesses. Teresa Urrea never does make it to Europe to learn more about these spiritual practices and her power. So she does live in New York City for a year. She heals, she garners press, as you can see in these slides of newspaper coverage of her. She also bears a child in New York City. And some speculate that she may have returned to California to be closer to friends and perhaps even family, because her father passes away in 1902, the year that she returns to California. But whatever the reason, she does come back to California in 1902, and she settles this time in Los Angeles. And she continues to heal, and she continues to engage in the politics of the city. So the final story that I want to share with you, bringing Teresa Urrea, back to California, to Los Angeles, takes place in the Boyle Heights neighborhood, called the Boyle Heights neighborhood today. So she took up residence in a cottage at the corner of State Street and Brooklyn Avenue in the Boyle Heights neighborhood. The Los Angeles Times described how her home was, quote, daily besieged by Mexican enfermos, sick ones, and that, quote, none go there without the belief that by the laying on of her magic hands, they will be cured. So coming to Los Angeles, she is immediately a news item in newspapers like the Los Angeles Times. But Teresa Urrea not only makes the news because of her healing, but she also engages in political activity in Los Angeles. And she lends her name and her stature as a Mexican curandera to a local labor protest movement. So on April 27th, 1903, Teresa Urrea leads 28 Mexican women in a procession down Main Street in downtown Los Angeles. The female procession marches past the Pacific Street electric car construction site, where over 50 Mexican track workers, or traqueros, drop their tools, follow the women, and walk off the job to join the strike for higher wages. These traqueros follow Santa Teresa and the women that are with her into the UFM, the United Federation of Mexican Workers headquarters in Sonora Town, the Mexican neighborhood adjacent to where the men are laying track. At the UFM headquarters, a Mexican flag was raised. And there, Teresa gave a speech that, according to one source, quote, exhorted the virtues of working class and ethnic solidarity. Afterward, after she gave this speech, she sat on the platform, on the stage with her fellow Mexicanas, listened to the other speeches, and then got up and, quote, followed by her band of women friends, leave the room. So one of the arguments that I make in Borderlands Curanderos is that Teresa Urrea's healing practice, her curanderismo, was political because it healed and strengthened both the individual and the social body that was often exploited by racist institutional powers in this period. So when I found the story of the 1903 Pacific electric strike and her support of the UFM, it confirmed what I hoped could be my argument. Here, Santa Teresa is politically active, not only spiritually as a healer, but also as a labor activist, supporting her fellow countrymen and women with her words, with her presence, demonstrating her solidarity with exploited workers by using her influence as a curandera to help the cause of struggling chiqueros and their family. So the context for this strike is Fiesta Days, or La Fiesta de Los Angeles. So turn of the century, Los Angeles saw exploitation of workers, like the Mexican traqueros, coupled with a racialization of all non-white Angelinos as others, even Mexicans, whose history was more closely tied to this region than any other group except indigenous peoples who were there first. Los Angeles had once been a part of Mexico, as all of the US Southwest had been, and it became a city which was equally at ease with celebrating a culture, while at the same time exploiting and oppressing those who prized that city, and in many cases literally built it. So the La Fiesta de Los Angeles was a yearly parade and celebration that took place from 1894 to 1916. The purpose of this was to kind of boost tourism and the profile of the city. There was sort of competition between San Francisco and Los Angeles as the premier Californian cities. As one enthusiastic civic booster claimed in 1903, no other medium has so successfully advertised to the world the possibilities of Southern California as has La Fiesta. During La Fiesta, Angelinos donned their fiesta wear. Retailers across the city advertised various kinds of fiesta apparel, including stylish fiesta suits and lovely fiesta shirtwaists. Spanish mantillas were available for high society women to drape across their faces as they crowded buildings and streets along the parade route, taking in floats portraying Spanish Franciscan missions, Mexican vaqueros, riding horses and donning sombreros. Yuma Indians were brought in from Arizona to portray Aztecs, and there was even a Chinese dragon. All of this organized and promoted by city boosters, politicians, and business people to celebrate multicultural Los Angeles. A really excellent source on the Fiesta Days is William Deverell's Whitewashed Adobe. I recommend that for more on this history. Thinking about all that is celebrated in Fiesta de Los Angeles, one also needs to remember that the Chinese had been excluded from the US since 1882, and also that many Mexicans living and working in Los Angeles at this time were deemed peons and outsiders whose labor was exploited by the very structures promoting the Mexican heritage of Los Angeles. So 1903, there was added pressure to make this particular La Fiesta go off without a hitch. President Theodore Roosevelt was going to attend. So the essential workers in the city who provided the labor that made La Fiesta happen, the chefs, the waiters, the streetcar operators, the traqueros, and many others, decided to take advantage of this. So in March and April of 1903, several hundred Mexican traqueros working in Los Angeles organized themselves into the UFM, this union, the United Federation of Mexican Workers, to press for better wages. They demanded an increase from 15 to 20 cents per hour for day work, 30 cents for night work and overtime, and 40 cents per hour for work on Sunday. They had timed this strike to interfere with plans to have the track ready for La Fiesta de Los Angeles when Teddy Roosevelt would come. Most of the press coverage of this strike portrays the Mexican strikers as followers that don't really know what they're doing, quote unquote peons that did not really understand what was going on, but had been seduced by foreign meddlers. But the opposite was true. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were striking in solidarity with their ethnic group and other workers across Los Angeles to try and shut down the city before the famous La Fiesta parade in order to pressure their bosses for these better wages. It's important to note that there is great risk in this, as the police in Los Angeles in this period aligned themselves with big business against labor. So the police presence was heavy along Main Street as word spread that there would be many, that there may be a public parade of strikers in the area to induce those who were continuing to work on the track to strike. In fact, on April 20, let me go backwards. Okay. On April 26, a group of about 30 women from Sonora Town helped the cause of the UFM when, according to the Los Angeles Times, quote, more than 30 of the Amazons, as they called these women, attempted to seize the shovels, picks, and tamping irons of the track workers, and the scabs, we call them, who had been imported from El Paso by Pacific Electric to replace the striking workers. One journalist from the Los Angeles Times described the heavy police presence at the site of the strike and explained that it was to protect the workers from the strikers and, quote, prevent trouble that it would have been unhealthy for any man or body of men to have attempted to interfere with the work. It's also important to note here that the Los Angeles Times was notoriously anti-labor and pro-business. So the LA Times coverage of the strike is very much on the side of Pacific Electric and paints the strikers in all kinds of derogatory ways. So April 27th, another procession comes down Main Street. However, it was not male strikers, but again, women, and this time led by Santa Teresa Urrea. The police let them pass without any harassment. And perhaps this was the strategy of the UFM, to enlist women so that police violence would be unacceptable against women. And if this were the case, this gendered strategy worked. Teresa Urrea used her special status in the Mexican community as a respected curandera, even a santa to many, to support the strikers and the UFM. One journalist, while perhaps exaggerating her power, still revealed her genuine influence when he wrote, quote, Mexicans will obey her. They fear, worship, and bow in humble submission to this strange little woman. The laborers asked no questions, but simply followed. So again, perhaps a little bit of exaggeration, but it does show that Teresa Urrea lent her status, lent her presence and her reputation to this strike. The secretary of the UFM stated that Santa Teresa even sent word to El Paso, where Pacific Electric was planning to collect workers to break the strike. Apparently, Teresa Urrea, quote, sent them her blessings and asked them to remain away. So all of this to say that Santa Teresa Urrea used her voice and her presence during the Pacific Electric strike to inspire many to remain loyal to the union, despite pressure from the Pacific Electric Company, the threat of violence from the police, and the possibility of losing their jobs. Despite the efforts of the UFM, track was laid in time for the Fiesta celebration, and the Pacific Electric streetcars, decorated in flowers, chugged along the lines during the annual parade, impressing President Roosevelt as a symbol of progress and modernization and of the multicultural city of Los Angeles. So if some triqueros did break the strike and return to work, they have good reasons. They had good reasons to do so. As the scholar Jeffrey Marcos Garcilaso points out in his book on the triqueros, he writes, the threat of violence from police, company reprisals, loss of income, lack of confidence perhaps in the union's ability to win, or perhaps most likely, these men and their families lived in boxcar housing provided by the company and found it difficult to stay with the strike and risk eviction. End of quote. So even if the strike failed to produce the outcome it desired, it provides a glimpse into the history and culture of turn of the century Los Angeles, labor activism, and Mexican solidarity in the face of increasing racism and discrimination. The Mexican curandera, Santa Teresa Urrea, was there. So to conclude, I'm going to go forward just a few slides here. Teresa Urrea leaves Los Angeles in 1904, and she eventually dies in Clifton, Arizona in 1906 at age 33. There's much more to her story, but her time in California cities as both an advocate for social justice and a healer of bodies remains a very important part of her story. And so I'm so happy to have been able to share this with you at the Homestead Museum. Thank you very much.